So I'm just introducing Sudhir ji here. Sudhir ji, to illustrate his career, he started his career as a graduate trainee, and from there he moved on to become president and CEO to various organizations. He is currently a founder and CEO of Enterprise System Solutions Private Limited. His areas of expertise is developing business between India and Japan, where with special attention to capital allocation, corporate finance, global supply chain management, management of subsidiaries, and also post-acquisition integration. So with this small introduction to Jaiswal ji, I'll be handing over the whole session to Jaiswal ji. So Sudhir ji, please.
Thank you, Abhishek. Thank you for this nice introduction. Namaste, Minasama, Konnichiwa. A warm welcome to all the participants of Konnichiwa Pune on behalf of IJBC, and a particular warm welcome to Your Excellency Ambassador Mr. Sanjay Kumar Verma for agreeing to be part of this session of Konnichiwa Pune 2021. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to introduce Ambassador Verma. Ambassador Sanjay Kumar Verma is an officer of 1988 batch of Indian Foreign Service. He was stationed at the Consulate General of India, Hong Kong, and at the Embassy of India in China, Vietnam, and Turkey, before serving as the Consul General of India in Milan, Italy. Ambassador Verma was also the Indian ambassador to the Republic of Sudan. Prior to his arrival in Japan as the Ambassador of India, Ambassador Verma worked in Ministry of External Affairs, MEA, New Delhi as Additional Secretary Administration, and was also in charge of the Cyber Diplomacy Division. Ambassador Verma is deeply passionate about information technology, artificial intelligence, cyber diplomacy, delivery of people-centric services using interactive technologies, guiding and facilitating small businesses and investors. Thank you, Mr. Verma. And with these words, I request Ambassador Sanjay Kumar Verma to deliver his special keynote address in this event. Ambassador Verma, over to you. Your Excellency, Mr. Verma, thank you very much for this special keynote address, quite insightful. And it was a real pleasure to hear your views. And I must tell you, a large part of it was, it was really a music to my ears, because I was in Japan for 3 years working for a large Japanese company, office Tokyo, and a less developed part of Japan, working under 1,500, working with 1,500 nationals, Japanese nationals. I was only Indian. After listening to you, I think that I wish I had some induction from you. My learning curve would have been shorter. Thank you so much for your speech and keynote address. Thank you very much. I request you to stay in the panel, stay here, because after this we have a panel discussion. And I guess your keynote address already has set the right background and context for the panel discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, in today's panel, our aim is to bring great minds together on India-Japan relationship, which is one of the most strategic partnership which has evolved over time. And there cannot be a better group of people what we have today afternoon. As you say, to have one of them is a privilege, and to have all three of them is extremely fortunate. Our first panel member is Ambassador Sanjay Kumar Verma. You heard him just now. Our second panel member is Professor and former Ambassador Gautam Bambawale. He's here. Welcome, Gautam Bambawale.
Thank you.
Ambassador Bambawale is an Indian diplomat and has served as the Indian ambassador to China, Pakistan, and Bhutan at the Ministry of External Affairs, and he was Joint Secretary for East Asia from 2009 to 2014. He is currently a distinguished professor, Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at Symbiosis International University, Pune. Professor Gautam is an adjunct fellow at Institute of Chinese Studies, and he keeps sharing his opinion pieces on various media houses, including Times Group. Welcome, Ambassador Bambawale.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our third panel member is Professor Srabani Roychoudhury. Professor Srabani Roychoudhury, Center Chair and Professor in Japanese Studies in the Center of East Asian Studies at School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi. She is an alumnus of JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and recipient of Japan Foundation Fellowship. And her major area of research is on Japan's economic relation with India focus. She has been a visiting scholar on different programs to Keijai Koho Center, Ministry of Economics and Industry, Japan, Policy Research Institute, Ministry of Finance, Japan, RE Aibe Kobe University and Nagoya University. This is the area where she goes and talks about her knowledge. She has wide range of publications and national and international journal. Her recent publications are centered on Japan economic relations and Japanese multinationals' experiences in India, their entry strategies, and their survival techniques. Welcome, Professor Srabani Roychoudhury.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. With the kind permission of the distinguished panel member, I try to set the context of this panel discussion. To make a beginning, just adding on what you all know and what Ambassador Sanjay Kumar Verma has talked in her keynote address. In 2022, next year, India and Japan will complete 70 years of their diplomatic ties. From a relatively narrow bilateral level, the relationship has transformed into a significant strategic partnership. However, the relationship between India and Japan goes back to the time of Indian monk Bodhisena visiting Todaji temple in Nara during 8th century. Also in the modern historical times, there had been strong bond and communication among eminent personalities of both the countries, like Swami Vivekananda, Rabindranath Tagore, and Tenshin Okakura. Our leader Subhash Chandra Bose took this relationship to a strategic level which stayed forever. Over the years, the religious, cultural, and philosophical linkages transformed into strong economic and trade relations. Now in the current decade, there is no doubt that India and Japan are natural partners in the strategic and economic space, which is getting institutionalized. That is the most important thing. Some of the established areas are diplomatic, trade, economic, and technical. My question is to start the panel discussion and request all of them to talk about how all of you think and see the contemporary Indo-Japan aspects in different fields. For example, trade and economics, energy security, infrastructure development, and how it is mutually beneficial. I request Ambassador Verma to go first, and then request Ambassador Gautam and subsequently Professor Srabani Roychoudhury. Ambassador Verma, your views on this.
Sorry, yes, I was on mute. Thank you. All these sectors which you mentioned are extremely important, not only from the bilateral perspective, but also from the global perspective, because both India and Japan are global players, and therefore whatever they do together or whatever they do individually will have an implication for the region and the world. As far as the trade is concerned, the main issue in the trade at the moment, which we need to take forward, is the certification and standardization, according to the need of the country concerned. So if we want to export beyond our conservative figures that we have today to Japan, we need to follow the practices in Japan. I always say that if my buyer wants a red shirt and if I go with a white shirt, I will not be able to sell it. Or if I am able to sell it, it will take me years to convince him that white is better than red. So therefore, we need to keep this in mind. Since I have spoken on all other aspects which you just asked during my address earlier, so I'll just keep quiet on them, and I would love to hear views from other panelists on these things, and if there is a need, I can come at the end. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Bambawale.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mr. Jaiswal. And of course, I would like to extend my greetings to my co-panelists, Ambassador Verma from Tokyo, of course, and Professor Srabani Roychoudhury from Delhi, both of whom are Japan experts. I don't think I know as much about Japan as they do, but let me give you my take for whatever it's worth. You know, as we all know, in the 70s, 80s, and perhaps even in the 90s, the India-Japan relationship was vastly different from what it is today. And it began to change in the year 2007, when the then Prime Minister of Japan, Mr. Shinzo Abe, made a visit to India, made a landmark visit to India, and he delivered a very famous speech at the Indian Parliament, which was, the title of the speech was The Confluence of the Two Seas. And that was the period, that was the time, that was the speech from which the relationship between our two countries started really changing and moving and fast forwarding. So I think that it was since then and right till today, 2021, when India and Japan now look at each other as very strong partners in the political military fields. We have a very strong strategic partnership. And of course, as all your listeners, all your participants know, that we are today members of the Quad, a group of 4 countries comprising Japan, India, Australia, and the United States. So from a strategic perspective, of course, the relationship has undergone a sea change. We have also benefited from this and in an economic aspect, in an economic perspective, because over the years, India has become the largest recipient of Japanese ODA. You have huge projects which are being undertaken by the Japanese government and companies here in India. The Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor is just one example. The Western Dedicated Freight Corridor is another example. The high-speed railway between Ahmedabad and Mumbai is a third example. But I think where we still need to do much more, Mr. Jaiswal, and I'll bring my remarks to an end with that, is, on this very strong partnership between the two governments, we need to add much more meat in terms of the people-to-people interaction. So we need to have much more interaction between ordinary people in Japan and ordinary people in India in terms of tourism, in terms of businesses doing more together, in the kind of way which you just mentioned, where you said that you had worked for a Japanese company for 3 years and you were the only foreigner amongst a whole sea of other Japanese people. So I think that is where we need to add more, more bulk to the relationship in terms of trade, tourism, investment, of course, from Japanese companies in India, Indian companies in Japan, and in the cultural sphere also. And therefore, I think a program like this over the next 2 days, Konnichiwa Pune, is something which is very welcome. And I congratulate all of you for having organized it. I'll stop there and hand the floor back to you.
Thank you, Ambassador Bambawale. This people-to-people connection is quite critical, and we'll come back to it in a while. But before we go in that category, I request Professor Roychoudhury to give her views on this.
Thank you, Mr. Jaiswal. First of all, congratulations to Konnichiwa Pune for this kind of an attempt in a COVID situation. And I hope sometime in future we can have it as an offline event also. And I'm, of course, extremely happy to be with such an esteemed panelist. And in spite of Professor, I call him Ambassador Bambawale, Professor Bambawale, saying that he's not so good with what he needs to say, but I think he's more or less taken whatever I needed to say. So I have to restructure what I want to say out here. As it starts off, definitely, in the 90s, one wouldn't have even envisaged the kind of relationship that India-Japan has today. Geopolitics has been one of the key reasons why Indo-Japan relationships have moved in the direction that it has. And it's very, very fortunate that for India that we have been able to synergize our strengths with that of Japan's to be able to today provide a kind of a bilateral relations, which also sort of becomes the core of other architectures that has come over in this Indo-Pacific zone, whether it is Quad or whether it is maritime security alternatives that have emerged. But because Konnichiwa Pune's major clientele is in business, I would like to concentrate on giving my opinion about what the business world's major issues, both from India and Japan. If you look at the macro data, whether it is trade or investments, while we feel very happy the way India-Japan's trade and investments have grown over, especially if you look at 2011 when we've had the CEPA, that is Comparative Economic Partnership Agreement till date. But if you look at Japan's trade and investment data, we fall short of many ASEAN countries. And this is something that we need to figure out. And it's very good to see that the JPEG survey every year has been moving us up and up in their viewership among the Japanese business in looking at India. And so we are now number 2 in the long term. However, in the short term, we are still considered to be 4th, 5th in their view of looking at coming to India. If we question why this is so, and in fact, the alternate supply chain, resilient supply chain that has been structured by Japan through its own government by giving incentive for their companies to move back out of China and find alternative destinations or go back to Japan. We've been at a loss. I remember how enthusiastically I had looked at the data thinking that this is the chance that we should be able to attract a lot of Japanese investments. But sadly, it's not been the way Vietnam and Indonesia has been able to attract. If one were to question this in the format of whether it's cultural affinity that obviously, or distance between these countries and Japan impact investments, it definitely does. We cannot sort of do away with it. But on the rebound, if Japan investments can go to USA and they're supposed to be the #1 investments in USA, that's also pretty farther than us if you look at it by kilometers, nautical miles. Question is then why aren't we being able to make ourselves attractive enough? And this is where I think the major question of people to people's exchange, cultural affinity, while we go back and talk about Buddhism and etc., current need is to capture the current Japanese people to understand that India is a place for them to come. It is not any longer that India is country that has a lot of cultural history and we come for tourism with respect to only having a travel in the Buddhist circuit. There is much more that we as an India can offer. And I think this is one place, if we can break barriers, we would be able to then encourage more of small and medium scale industries from Japan to reach us as a destination for their own production as well as collaboration. Why I moved to MSME sector for Japan is because if you look at the Japan's economic development in the past, it has been basically based on the middle, medium and small scale enterprises and their innovations which happened and which is why they are where they are, as both the ambassadors have pointed out during their keynote address and further on. We must realize that it is this place that we need to target and be able to gain certain amount of advantage. Are we in a position to do it? I think currently we are definitely in a position to do it. We have a lot of policies in place, lot of institutions that have been created to train, build our skill sets, and we should be now really synergizing with Japan to encourage middle and small scale industries of Japan to place themselves within India. We've been extremely good at changing certain set of policies and therefore we've moved up in the rank of business as destination, which is really something that we need to promote to these business world of Japan. On the rebound, if you look at even Indian investments and Indian takes in with respect to Japan, we also have not been very forthcoming in exploring Japan as a market, whether it is to do with IT sector, whether it is to do with AI sector, or it is to do with bottom end manufacturing sectors. But of course, Japan being a high cost economy, many of these will not work, but many of services sector can definitely be a way of finding footing in Japan. And I think this is one place that we can also concentrate. When it comes to people's exchange, I think education is one primary area that we should concentrate. While people talk about people's exchange at the higher education level, I think grooming the younger generation at the school level is rather more important. While we do have a lot of programs being established to teach the language in the CBSE, for instance, has Japanese language as an alternative language to read. I think encouraging a 3-language system in which they do a foreign language and encouraging Japanese language would be a good option, and also to encourage something like what has become very popular among school students is to go for model United Nations debating thing. If we could sort of encourage something like that for Japan, in which they get to see Japan and also get to see get an interest in the country, and that can influence them to take up certain courses, which would then lead to good higher education and travel to Japan. I have witnessed this among European countries, academic people who say that their initiation into Japan was during their school and during homestays during their school. So I advocate something like this if we could look at. As far as whether we will be able to collaborate, cooperate, and procreate, I think there are enough on the plate today for us to be able to cooperate, collaborate, and procreate with Japan. And I think the 2022 as the 70th year can be a real good platform to begin things like how in 10 years earlier in 2002, we had also done as 2012, similar exercises of improving tourism, etc. was done, and that raised the number of tourist travel from India to Japan. And a very small study had come to the conclusion that people have now started noticing Japan beyond just kimonos and ikebana and tea ceremony. I think I'll stop out here. We can continue with the discussions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Srabani Roychoudhury. It is absolutely important what all suggestion you have given, because to deepen the cooperation and the relationship with two countries, it is important that there is a strong people-to-people bonding and ties among the people. There are among 40,000 plus Indian nationals staying in Japan on long-term visa, but it is much less than the number of people from a country like Nepal staying, Nepalese citizens staying in Japan. I would like to take this point and ask Ambassador Sanjay from Verma, possibly what measures we can take to improve and strengthen the people-to-people contact, to raise the visibility. As Professor Roychoudhury, it is not about curry and kimono, it's much more than that. What kind of possibly cultural and academic initiative you can take? Your thoughts, please.
Thank you very much. The first thing I would suggest is to encourage more Indian students to come to Japan and live in the ecosystem that Japan offers with the academic system that they have. And of course, whosoever comes to Japan for studies will also most likely find their work in the Japanese economy as well. So any student who comes here, more or less, is expected to stay in Japan for a longer period. This has been seen, you mentioned about Nepal, this has been seen from the Nepalese students coming to Japan, from Vietnamese students coming to Japan, from Chinese students coming to Japan. So student exchange is an extremely important vehicle to initiate a better people-to-people relationship. They are the ones who are only doing the exchange for academic purposes to start with, and later on for the job if that is available. Everyone else will be more transitory in the approach, either trading a commodity or trying to get an investment. So therefore, that is very important. And when in early 90s we were facing severe foreign currency crunch, Japan was one of the first countries which provided us with a check without much of security check done, which started our economy once again. So Japan had been a close friend. Somewhere in the middle, when we had tested we had conducted our nuclear test. At that time, things went awry, and probably Ambassador Bambawale was the joint secretary or around that at that point of time, so he would have handle it from Delhi. Second thing which was raised by Professor Roychoudhury was regarding Japanese investments going to ASEAN. Now, first thing we have to understand that Japanese companies are not moving out of China. That is a very important factor to understand. Their new investments are going away from China. So those companies, with 14,000 companies which are invested in China, they remain in China. If they are doing some new fresh investments or incremental investments, that is likely to go out. If I give you the number, you'll be surprised that in 1 year, there were only 156 companies which chose to invest outside China while they could have invested in China as well. So it's not a large number. And going to China is not for the market. Going to China is for integration of supply chain. ASEAN offers a similar facility to them. It's one single market, and therefore logistics are easier within ASEAN. So when I talk of ASEAN, I don't talk of a country because it gives them one customs union, and therefore it's much easier for them to arrange the logistics. When they go to ASEAN, they go again for the supply chain integration, backward and forward both. And when they go there, what happens is, see, Japan started coming to India in a big way towards the later half of the first decade of this century. But in ASEAN, they were there for a long, long time. So by the time the first, not the first, but say the 100th Japanese company would have come to India, ASEAN had 18,000 Japanese companies by then. So there is a better supply chain integration amongst the Japanese companies themselves in ASEAN, and therefore that's a lure to attract them further in the ASEAN region. So we need to pay a lot of attention on the supply chain ecosystem that will attract the Japanese investors more. As far as SMEs and MSMEs are concerned, Japanese SMEs are not known to be very international in any case. So what happens is that if you are a principal Japanese company going somewhere, they will take the vendorship with them to that geography, which we have seen with Suzuki, which we have seen with Toyota. They came to India, they brought in a lot of vendors with them to India. So therefore, if we are serious on MSMEs or SMEs, we will have to focus on those principals who can bring them along with them. Japanese companies prefer to remain in one geography, and therefore having good Japan-focused industry zones or industrial parks would be a better idea. Nimrana, we have seen. Sri City, we have seen how they developed so fast when they focused only on Japan. Supply chain, when it comes to innovation, it's also a supply chain. So in innovation supply chain, the maximum amount of Japanese investment has come to India, not to ASEAN. At the moment, in the startup ecosystem from Japan, the direct investment from Japan is close to about $9.3 billion in Indian startup ecosystem. And rule of thumb would say that there will be another $4 to $5 billion, which would have come via Singapore or some other countries, but actually Japanese money. At Japanese language, I must congratulate to the students in India. They have taken it really well. Last year, we had 26,000 students taking Japanese language proficiency exam, not only learning the language. So that's a very good number. Now we need to convert these numbers into people working with Japanese companies in Japan or in India, which means to inculcate information, knowledge, and exposure to the Japanese culture, Japanese way of doing things, as well as the Japanese standards and codes. So if we are able to do that, probably many of these students will be able to relate with Japan much closer, and therefore for the future they become the ambassadors for P2P relationship, the people-to-people relationship. I'll just stop here. These are all my perspectives, which I thought I'll clarify in this.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Verma. And thank you for bringing this important subject of diversification of supply chain, which I was about to come, picking from here, because the COVID-19 pandemic has actually fast-forwarded the need for digital transformation, as I talked about, for the most companies, large companies across the globe, and also need to diversify the supply chain of the companies. These two things have clearly come up. In this context, of course, it is equally applicable to Japanese company, Indian company. And now India has proven itself a country with excellent talent pool, and a cutting-edge technology in terms of manufacturing operations. And also you talked about very important thing on innovation, which has three pillars of co-innovation, co-creation, and led to co-production, basically how the idea to transform into industrialization. The question is that, and I will address to Professor Srabani Roychoudhury, how do you think this role of high technology is going to play in shaping the foundation of Indo-Japan economic relationship actually?
India-Japan Vision 2025 has listed out a large number of industries which are going to be core focus for the India-Japan economic relations. And if you look at it, you realize that it can be linked to the Quad set of country, listed areas where Quad also would like to work. So it's like, coming together, weaving into the Quad as well as the bilateral relations. And you have three areas that we can look at. They're called critical technologies, they're called emerging technologies, and also destructive technology. Critical technologies are probably a set of technologies on which we are more or less today at work, and we're innovating and moving forward. And it is this area that I think both in terms of strategic military defense sector, as well as in areas of Indian manufacturing sector, where we can pool in resources. Mainly our technical skilled workers who are cheaper, more vibrant, and very adaptive. Indian engineering pool is considered to be very adaptive towards any kind of new challenges, and that is one thing that could be. And Japanese general finance, as well as strong hardware hardware technological aspect that Japan is good at, would be a good combination on which we could find platforms of working. But it is in the emerging technologies in which I think the next round of industrial revolution 4.0 that we're talking about in the world is where I think India and Japan should quickly come into some certain platforms, which would therefore be able to spin India into the orbit of a very industrialized nation. In the emerging technologies, Japan has moved it towards the S&D, that is Sustainable Development Goals of United Nations, on which they have drawn their emerging technologies, one being strongly the renewable energy sector, which would be countering the energy requirement of Japan, which has always been a problem for Japan because of the distance between the oil producing nations and Japan having to take it all the way from the Middle East to Japan. And they have been much more involved in creating the emerging technology or sense of renewable energy. Of course, there has been an issue that they had concentrated on nuclear energy, and then the Fukushima disaster, and thereof, we will not get into that. But in the emerging, one is definitely the renewable energy, but one which is probably something that would come into motion over a period of time is what is Japan calling the blue economy. It is where harnessing the maritime resources for development purposes, which is, I think, a very, very new area. And I think it is concentrating on such new areas between our two countries actually will propel India to a different trajectory than what we've been traditionally been looking at. And I think this is where I think we can have a good outing. And Japan has, through its various fellowships, and especially in the MEXT fellowship, they have been concentrating on the areas of maritime engineering, maritime oceanography, etc., where we recently, for the last 5 to 8 years, been sending 1 or 2 students per year, which could be a very good area where we could probably explore. As far as destructive engineering goes, technologies goes, one is much talked about today financially. We're talking about the cryptocurrency, the crypto world, which is being created to disrupt the current financial system to a new kind of financial system. These are exploratory areas in which I wouldn't be very confident in talking about it, because it is something that's too technically driven and it is not my forte. But however, I think critical technologies is where we should be looking at higher education academic engagements in which you use laboratories of each other as well as academic people in these areas who would venture and try to create the base level sciences technology, which could then be used in various forums. But if you look at AI, and that is where I think India has a lot to learn from Japan, because Japan stands #1 in the AI technology. And India has a substantial educated pool which can work in this field. And Japan definitely has a shortage of people in that field. So I think that would be one place where we could probably concentrate and get into action driven plans, which would therefore promote this sector. And we would have a great advantage in the global economy. Digital infrastructure, which is much talked about today beyond the traditional infrastructure, is one area where we've already been collaborating. And I think we have a great future with the Blue Dot Network policy that has got created. We have a great future and an outing in this. These are all areas which would obviously encourage startup companies. And I think Japan is one of the prominent startup company, and venture capitalists from Japan are very keen in these areas. It is only, I suppose, needs to be matched. And I'm sure there are JEPIC out here from Japan, and we have CII, FICCI. They all must have created digital official engagement platforms, which should create more synergies between our two countries. I think I'll stop out here. We can take any questions later.
Thank you, Professor Roychoudhury. As you know that the India-Japan Digital Partnership, IJDP as we call it, and the Startup Hub is getting a lot of traction. And India also, the startup innovation, maybe surprisingly, has really come up very nicely. And a lot of Japanese companies are taking active interest in India and vice versa. So that's very good news in terms of disruptive technology, exploratory technology. But all innovations, underlying thing is disruption. Underlying thing is taking risk, underlying thing is to exploration. So a lot of action happening upon it, maybe take up some question later on. But taking forward from here, in the context we're talking about India and Japan, we talked about and we know and we can look forward for a lot of complementarities between two economies. Which basically, if you can say that combining Japan's capital and technology with India's rich human resources and skill, makes it a very winning combination for both the countries. And many times we heard that Indian leaders talk about the 3D mantra, which is democracy, large demography, and a growing demand in India. My question is that, and I now take up to Gautam Bambawale, Ambassador, that sufficiency of this 3D mantra to holistically enhance this cooperation among these two nations. And what more needed to be done, more to be focused for the strategic and cultural alignment, otherwise it become a very trading alignment. What are the possible binding factors which can be leveraged upon? Ambassador Gautam.
Yeah, no, it has been a very interesting discussion, and I completely agree with the views expressed by all of you, including both the panelists, Ambassador Verma and Professor Roychoudhury. The way I look at it is that the Delhi Metro, when it was built with Japanese assistance, it was such a successful project that you now have cities across the length and breadth of India, many of them who want to build similar metro systems. I think we need one success story in the private sector. And whether it is a startup or whether it is a well-established Indian company which is doing this in collaboration with other companies, I think we just need one successful example which will then produce so much interest that it will get replicated across the length and breadth of India. And I'm looking forward to what it is. We have had a number of recent IPOs. I think most of those companies have had some Japanese venture capital interest in it, whether it's Nykaa, whether it is, we've recently had Paytm, etc. But I think one successful example is required, which will fire the imagination of people in India and Japan, and then get replicated across the length and breadth. I'm not talking of the sector, I'm not talking of the product, I'm talking of the nature of the collaboration between India and Japan, whether it is financial, basically financial in nature, or whether it's finance plus technology, or whether it's finance plus technology plus people. I think that is what is required, and I hope that that will come to the fore very, very soon.
Thank you. I'll just a bit change gear and talk about related things only. This is about perception gap and maybe reality gap. So while there are huge complementarities between two countries, there are certain perception gaps and possibly there's some real gaps. For example, and I can talk about my experience, all clocks in Japan, anywhere in place, shows one time. And punctuality is the core of everything, for example. The air conditioning settings in Japan, any office you go, it is a certain temperature, irrespective of where you go. There's no change. That's my experience. And there are multiple things we can go on. You can see kids age of 5 or 6 year old. My child himself, I'm taking admission, casually said that how to go to school, and the agents told us that you'll take a train and go. What's the problem? A 6-year-old guy taking local train and go. I was not able to relate to what she's saying. We can go on. And the situation in India on certain instances can be different than this. And there could be certain cultural issues and could be structural issues. This means that there is a road to travel in this regard to build upon this. So my question, maybe I'll come to all panels. What are the possible measures that can be undertaken? What is the possible role of business and people in general, or maybe role of IGBC itself, to narrow down the gap to the ground reality level, so that the perception and reality, the gap, is narrowed down? So I can start with Ambassador Verma, then I'll take up with others. So your suggestion, what measures possibly we can take?
Actually, you are absolutely bang on. There are perceptual gaps, and the perceptual gaps will depend on the person you're talking to. If a person is well-traveled, his perceptual gaps will be different as compared to a person who has never left the geography. So the only way to handle such perceptual gaps is through raising awareness. And as IGBC, I would suggest to bring out whatever magazines or newsletters or whatever you have, or go on the television or use some other channels, YouTube or whatever, to tell people what is actually happening in the society and what is the perception. Because unless people are aware of something which is not a fact, they will consider fiction as the fact. And that is, as long as we are able to do that, we have crossed the bridge. There, I will come back on the same suggestion which I have given earlier. The best way is to exchange students. There is nothing better than that. So if the students of the two countries from Japan who are comfortable in English can go to India, from India who are comfortable with Japanese language can come to Japan to study, they will be living in the societies of each other for a longer time, and therefore, looking at them, some of the perceptual gaps could be removed. Thank you.
I'm sure a lot of university representatives are watching this program, and definitely they will come up with the student exchange program. Professor Roychoudhury, your views on this, on perception, reality, and the gap?
Perceptions differ, and as Ambassador Verma just now pointed out, that perception differs because everyone's experiences differently, the culture. While, of course, the best thing is to transfer or people between two countries and submerge them into the society, which automatically leads to certain learning and understanding. Perception dissolves. While it is acceptable, doable, it is not so, financially probably doable for us right now to sort of send en masse 300, 400 students, say, every month or something like that for a period of 6-8 months. However, I definitely have in mind something like I know when my son grew up, he saw a lot of animation of Japan. And when he went to Japan, therefore, he searched for such things which he had seen in the animation, definitely having built his own perception on the things that he saw. I don't know why we cannot sort of do such animated, for children cartoon series, which talks about our contemporary Indian children's way, lifestyles, etc., which is what the Japanese did in a more innovative and bringing in an imaginary friend, etc. I think we should also try something. We've tried to do it with Ramayana and Hanuman as a replica of Superman. I think these are copy pasting things. Rather look at something very contemporary to what the Indian teenager or Indian Indian children are going through, and convert it into a good movie or a thing. For instance, I think the Kota Factory, which is so popular today in Netflix, would have a very good outing if it was translated or subtitled into Japanese, because they also have a similar problem. And once we can connect connect these kind of dots within the society, certain perceptions will move, certain perceptions would be created, which would encourage more interest in either students, children from Japan. Because why? It's amazing. Children from India are still keen and want to know about Japan today. But I don't see a similar thing from Japanese children. That means we have not been able to infiltrate or create an image of wanting to visit India. And I think that has to be not through only people-to-people's exchange, but multifaceted social media, as well as these kind of new, Netflix, etc., where we do see a lot of Japanese, movies coming in. I think these are areas that we can explore as an alternatives.
Thank you, Professor. Ambassador Bambawale, your views.
Yeah, sure. I'm not very sure I understood your question, Mr. Jaiswal, because and I may be wrong in making this conclusion, but if you think that India should be a clone of what happens in Japan, I'm afraid that's not possible at all. India has to be India. We have our own strengths and we have to play to those strengths. And India cannot be Japan. Japan has its own culture and its own strengths. So I don't think like everything is so similar in Japan, I don't think that's going to happen in India. There are going to be differences in different parts of India as far as our culture, our attitude to work, etc. is concerned. But if that is your question, the point about perception is a very valid point, of course. And there, of course, as both the panelists, Ambassador Verma, Professor Roychoudhury has said, every Japanese person who comes to India or visits India for a short time or a long time has a different takeaway, has a different perception of India, depending on his or her experiences. And that is how it should be. I don't think it can be one size fits all kind of perception. Also, I would like to raise, a certain topic. I would like to raise a certain idea which has been troubling me, in the sense that why is it that Korean pop, K-pop, has become so popular amongst the youngsters in India today, but Japanese pop, which is fairly similar, as far as an older person like me is concerned, it may be different as far as youngsters are concerned, but why is it that K-pop has become so popular and J-pop is not popular? This is something that not just people in Japan, but also people in India must focus on, must think about, and must try to rectify. So I completely agree with what all of you have been saying, that we need to have a much stronger people-to-people relationship, and only that will transform the India-Japan relationship as a whole. But I think we need to make joint efforts in that direction. Students are, of course, one of the most important ways of doing that, but also the transmission of culture both ways is something that we must focus on. Thank you.
Yeah, you're right, Ambassador Bambawale. Like when you look from an Indian perspective, we look at developed countries, awareness about Western world is far more, in terms of, what we say, we watch BBC, we may watch Friends, we watch other series, but our own, those who live in India, our own exposure to Japanese, other aspect like J-pop we talked about is very limited to what we have it, and possibly a lot of work to be done from a cultural side, maybe requesting NHK to have, today I think that only one distribution provider has NHK as channel. We need to check with others. Coming to a previous point, yes, the answer lies in the adaptiveness and being flexible enough and being reliable enough to understand each other to bring down the perception gap. That's what I was referring to. Thank you for your views. Now, coming back to other areas of Japan-India discussion we talked about. Again, we talk a lot of things about economic relationship, the bilateral partnership. But again, it comes back many times. It's a resource-driven partnership. We talked about resources there and the resource-based partnership. And now, of course, over the years, it's become more strategic partnership. How to find and build upon, and you all have talked about, but I may need more detailed discussion from your side to help all of us to bring new complementarities. How we go beyond trade. What's the way forward? For example, like Japan has world-class healthcare system. India started its own Ayushman Bharat, which is very exciting, and possibly that's the way forward. Taking out other things, smart cities. What is the way forward for us to find out more complementarities? What could be the framework? Your suggestion, Ambassador Bambawale.
I was very excited when I read the recent the outcomes from the recent quadrilateral meeting, which took place in Washington, D.C. in September. And I was excited to see that there are going to be 100 scholarships for equal number of students from all the 4 countries to come together to study and to ideate at US universities. And I think if we can do something similar in India, between India and Japan, or maybe even bring in a third country, India, Japan, Korea, if you want to, or India, Japan, Nepal, if you want to, that would bring some kind of excitement into these exchange programs and students exchange programs. So that's something which I wanted to feed into all of you. I also think that we need to have more Japanese restaurants in India, because I think that is something which spreads Japanese culture. I find that there are more Korean restaurants coming up, but they are much greater in number than Japanese restaurants. And I keep asking myself the question, why is this happening in India? So I think we need to have answers in those areas and those fields. We need to work together to boost this. I think it has to go beyond government. We should also have the private sector helping out in doing this, and I think they will be able to complement the efforts of the governments of the 2 countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bambawale. Mr. Verma.
Yeah, on the food side, if I can just inform Ambassador Bambawale that in Japan we have about 5,000 restaurants which serve Indian food, out of which about 2,200 are between Tokyo and Yokohama. So, food-wise, we are doing very well. Yeah. No, but on serious note, many a times what happens is that government and business do not go in tandem. So the government thinks that these are the critical technologies we should go in. It is not essential that the business. For example, Professor Roychoudhury was talking about critical technologies. Look at rare earth. Look at semiconductor fab. So critical technology fields where we need to come together, but businesses are not able to put wrap around this particular philosophy. So business and government can not go in tandem, and that's my conclusion. And therefore, there will be a lag. Sometimes the lag will be against the business. Sometimes the lag will be against the government. How do we bridge that lag? Again, unless you have B2G conversations happening very often, that lag cannot be. In Japan, that lag is easily filled in because the structure of business in Japan is different. Most of the things are nomination basis. In our case, most of the things are tendered out, and therefore they have to be on certain other parameters. So the structure is very different. Therefore, that that keeps happening. Resource-based partnership, that is there. Probably the export is not there to demonstrate that, but that is very much there. On the K-pop and J-pop issue which Ambassador Bambawale raised, K-pop is extremely popular in Japan when compared to J-pop. So probably they are good marketeers. They have been able to market it much better than the Japanese would have marketed J-pop, or even a better stream of culture. Now, it's a deeper question whether they want to market it, they do not want to market. These are deeper questions which I'll not get into at the moment. But the thing is that there are cultural uniqueness which we need to understand. And one point I will sort of readdress, which Ambassador Bambawale talked about. Japan cannot be India and India cannot be Japan. And we should be very, very clear on that. Many a times I have found that Indians living here, they will always say, you know, we do this in Japan, why can't we do it in India? These are two different societies. These are two different systems and cultures. So therefore, we have to be cognizant of that. I'll stop at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Verma, Ambassador Verma. Professor Roychoudhury.
Not much to say after what has been already said about how to go about, creating more bridges. I think, so far we've generally, if you look at between, say, even 2000 when Prime Minister Modi came and till date, I think at government level, we've now firmly established and there is no second thought to it that we're propelling this relationship and going further and further in a right direction. I think both countries' business is more or less understood that they can make good connections. But I think right now the need is ground level, say associations of, say you have associations of, say pharmaceutical companies in Japan. We need association of Indian companies in Japan talking to each other. And to move beyond Tokyo and Osaka, I think, target now the prefectural level thing. Like Nagoya is a huge hub. Hamamatsu is a huge hub. Kobe, of course, people know because we have a lot of Indian diaspora out there, but there are other hubs that is there. Niigata is another hub that is there. I think some way, those connections have to now start happening. Probably then this whole, because my concern always remains that, we are not able to use the complementaries between this business world effectively. We have a lot of chance of doing a much better job. I think that is things that we can drive in this year 2022 and see if we can have a roadmap available for the business people or understand what's the problem with the Japanese business coming here and probably have a study group or something like that, which can ultimately give some kind of a good understanding. It's been very difficult. I've done twice over, even after CEPA was formulated, I looked at opportunities for things, certain opportunities have found some, like Shiseido does have a thing out here, Uniqlo has come to India, but it's much less than what one could desire. I think that is why we need to work on this. And I think 2022 can be one year that we can dedicate to such jobs for ourselves.
Thank you, Professor Roychoudhury. It is absolutely apt that, in India, as you are aware, and among, India, Japan, there is sister state and sister city cooperation starting, already there. There as of now, there are 7 Indian states and 3 city regions have partnered with the different prefectures of Japan. As much, a very, very not so known or less developed prefecture of Japan, Shimane, where I worked, has a very good tie-up with Kerala government. I was surprised when I was there. Possibly I was the only foreigner at that time when I landed there. And second part, we talked about that when you go to Tokyo, things might have changed now, but 7-8 years before even, quite recently, either you are in IT sector or you are in restaurant sector. So Ambassador Verma, you're right. There's so many restaurants. They expect either you're running a restaurant or you're in IT sector. Very difficult to say you're working in manufacturing sector. I was in manufacturing sector. So thank you very much for your insightful discussion. Before we take any other question, I request Abhishek, if there is a question in YouTube, because the people are watching this panel discussion in YouTube. In case there is a question, we can take up now. Abhishek, you
Yes,
have
so we
any
have
question?
yes. So we have a couple of questions for Professor Srabani. The only request will be you have to keep it a little short because we are
Yeah.
just 3 minutes away
Yeah.
from our
Okay.
next
Yes.
schedule. So this is the question is, what are the critical factors to bring Japanese MSME to India? That is one. And the other is, what about the Korean education system of Japan?
I didn't get the second question.
What about the Korean KOSEAN education system of Japan? So maybe the time will permit only for one question. So what
I
are the
think,
critical factors?
yeah, I think Kunni, since your clientele is essentially the business world, what were the
Yeah.
critical areas which we can ensure that MSME comes to India?
Yes.
I personally think it's important for Indian MSME or Indian company to identify and target one or two companies, MSME company of Japan, and try to engage with them in some of more of a instead of going with a product or need of a product, to first informally engage what they call as nemawashi in Japanese term, that is an informal engagement before you start talking business. Two, I think having a very defined outcome of what you want out of this particular exchange is also very important. Sometimes, from Indian point of view, we take a much bigger thing and then start, cutting it down to suit. Rather than that, I think having a very firm engagement with a firm agenda, in which you allow the Japanese to formulate it more than we asking that this is what we want. That kind of a nuanced engagement is probably something that would be important. Japanese companies, I know MSME talk about, they definitely want Japanese food in the country that they go. And I always tell that, like somehow noodles seem to be soba shop is very keenly looked at as an alternative to getting to feel at home in the country. And they claim that they get it till Thailand. It is only in India that they don't get it. I of course, try to tell them that you can have your curry rice out there. That is a far easier deal for India to innovate rather than your sobas. But I do know that these are issues, and they still consider it to be a far off country. Like it seems to them that Malaysia is a much closer country to go to than India. I think we need to work, and I think our extremely consumerist market is going to be one attraction which will not be able to keep the MSME out of India. But I think these are two areas that, first step is to do a nuanced engagement. And I think that's where the associations would become a very good option for us to use.
Now I think, thank you. So now I think we are constrained by time to take this interesting discussion forward. It was an honor for me to host this panel today. I thank Ambassador Verma, Ambassador Bambawale, and Professor Roychoudhury for sparing their valuable time and giving the valuable insights on this subject. I'm sure, and I'm quite hopeful, that today's panel discussion will trigger to initiate new action points among various stakeholders among Japan and India. Now at the end, I call upon Mr. Siddharth for his view to end the session. Thank you. Arigato gozaimashita.
Good afternoon and good evening. My name is Siddharth Deshmukh. I'm a current president of Indo-Japan Business Council, and it's been really, really entertaining and education, lot of education, lot of learning through this panel discussion and keynote of Ambassador. I've been enjoying from last hour or so. So many things to learn, so many new point of view. Just 1 week back, I returned from India, and I'm thinking of Japan already. And this event is happening. So I once again thank you, all of you, Ambassador Mr. Sanjay Kumar Verma. Thank you so much for sparing your time. Almost 1.5 hours. That's amazing for in IGBC members and audience here. Thank you, Ambassador Gautam Bambawale and Professor Srabani Choudhury. Thank you so much, and I look forward to have a conversation in some other forum in future with all of you, and hopefully some of I can meet some of you that I'm back in India. So it's a really pleasure listening to you. Thank you so much.